Good day, I am TAN KeeWee. Today, I'm going to tell you how I think World War III will come to an end. So let's begin. Nowadays, it's difficult to know what is the difference between truth and fake news. That's because mainstream media show us what they want us to see. For instance, who is winning the Ukraine-Russia war? Some people think that Russia is winning. Some people think that there's a stalemate. Next example, who started the Hamas-Israel conflict? Some people think it's Hamas, and it started in October. But some people think, no, the roots go deeper. It goes back a few years. Again, who's behind the concert attack in Moscow recently? Some people will say, or want us to think that it's ISIS, but others think that it is the intelligence unit of Ukraine, Britain, and USA. The truth actually depends on our sources, where we get it from. Will it be mainstream media or social media? I say this because economic data can also be untruthful. You think that there's no inflation, when in fact there is, you suffer. When economists use such untruthful data, we can get the wrong projections. That's why in the next few minutes, my talk could be untruthful too, depending on my source. I want you to read this before I proceed. I shall begin with chapter 1. How are we in World War III? About more than a year ago, I said that the Battle of Ukraine is ending and the Battle of Taiwan is beginning. This has been reflected in a change in leadership. A Russian hawk has stepped down, and a China hawk in the form of Kurt Campbell has taken over our place. Since many battles make up a war, whether it's Battle of Taiwan, Battle of Ukraine, we are all in the middle of World War III. Why do I say that? Because actually the G7 NATO nations have always denied that they were involved in the Ukraine conflict. But all this changed in the month of February when a few German generals were caught discussing how to strike Russia using a German-made Taurus missile. They were actually planning to hit a bridge, Kerch Strait Bridge, which is actually Russian territory. But the takeaway from this check, this discussion, was that the Germans said that the other G7 countries were already involved in the war. A few days later, it was reported that CIA has actually been building up 12 secret spy bases in Ukraine as a shadow war against Russia. A few days later, Macron said that he wanted to send French troops into Ukraine. What he said was actually what France has been doing for the past few months. And then a month later, there was this terrorist attack in this Moscow concert hall. Now, when you kill civilians of another country, it's a classic act of war. Similarly, a month ago, the US based 2,000 soldiers in Kinmen Islands. This belongs to Taiwan, but it is just a few kilometers away from China. Again, putting armed men in another country is a classic show of the declaration of war. So, we are actually in the middle of a war. Who are the participants? We have G7 countries and NATO on one side, and Russia and China on the other side. A war, World War III, comes in many different forms. It could be an economic war. It started with sanctions against Russia 10 years ago, trade sanctions, tariffs against China by Trump in 2018, technology war, seizing, arresting the Huawei CFO, chip and phone bans, these are all part of the technological war. Military, of course, the Ukraine and Russian war is one, and the Gaza war, I'll explain later, it's also part of this world war. And of course, the psychology of it all. You come up with propaganda to dehumanize the other party. And of course, financial war, which is the moving large flows of money to destroy the other side's markets. For instance, Chinese stocks have been battered down in the past few months. In the meantime, Japanese stocks have hit way above its record just around 1990. Indian stocks are up. From an economist point of view, actually, there's no change to warrant such a bull run in India and Japan. You look at it, Chinese GDP growth rates are about the same, hasn't really changed much. Indian growth rates are still very good. It's 8%, it's big because the economy is smaller. And Japanese growth is as weak as ever. So why? Why did Japan and Indian stocks run up? It's all due to how the analysts in Wall Street persuade and convince us. They tell us that that is the next market to grow in, and the whole world jumps into them. And the Western media will play that part by saying that everything is looking good for India and Japan. In fact, I don't think anything has changed much in Japan and India. So the question is, why are they starting this world war? The answer is they want to maintain their brand of imperialism. And what is imperialism? That means it's a policy of gaining power over another country through colonization, through military force, or economic dominance. Let's go back to Economics 101. There is this factors of production. Basically, it's divided into land, labor, capital, and enterprise. From the imperialist point of view, the world can be divided into places with different factors of production. On one hand, capital, the US will produce, print the money. Entrepreneurship, no one doubts that they've been in the forefront of technology for many years. Okay? And so they wish to maintain that level, the control of capital and entrepreneurship. On the other hand, who provides the land? Well, Russia is a good example. It has a lot of untapped and cheap resources. And who provides the labor? China has always, well, for past 40 years anyway, been the provider of cheap labor and efficient labor too. Now, the idea is this, because it stems from maybe after 30 years of their experience, because since the USSR collapsed in 1991, Russia has been a cheap and abundant source of raw materials. Western multinationals benefited tremendously from it. So Russia is a provider of land. China, since 1978, has been the provider of cheap and efficient labor. This is the ideal model of imperialism. You buy cheap materials from Russia, you get cheap labor from China, put them together. Of course, they come out with the design and packaging, and then you sell the finished products at a markup. But this brand of imperialism has been facing pushback in recent years. Both Russia and China thinks that there is a better way. In other words, you see, in the past, China would supply all the spare parts for the American manufacturers. This is what maybe the imperialists want. And now, yes, Tesla has come out with EV cars, but China has also come up with their own cars, and they want to compete. But this is not what the imperialists want. They want China to supply the spare parts, not to supply the finished cars in competition with American cars. So World War III started to maintain this ideal model of imperialism. So you have to get Russia into a fight. In fact, they've been trying to get Russia into a fight for the past 10 years because they thought that Russia was a pushover. Russia, according to this famous quote, is a gas station pretending to be a country. It's an easy victim. In fact, days before Russia invaded Ukraine, there was this annual conference, Munich Security Conference. There, they repeated that they wanted Ukraine to join NATO. This crossed Russia's red line. And so they started the war, which is what they wanted. Why do they want to start a war with Russia? The aim was to balkanize Russia. That means break up Russia into different countries, provinces, sectors, like in the 1990s when USSR broke up, because they would want to exploit Russian resources once again. But Russia proved unbeatable. So now they move on to the next target, which is China through Taiwan. What they have done, we have all observed. They've been stoking tension between the two China. They've been creating mayhem around China with their color revolution in Hong Kong, in Thailand. You know, you look at this, the umbrellas that they use, the helmets that they use, it seems that they all came from the same factory. And of course, stir up quarrels in South China Sea. And we have Philippines to be their men to stir up trouble over some blocks of islands in South China Sea. But this plan to provoke China, get China to start a war, slipped recently. Because in October last year, the Gaza conflict erupted. What happened was that when this erupted, their attention was diverted. Just now I mentioned about the Gaza uprising. Well, in this chapter 2, I'm going to tell you a bit about the Hamas-Israel conflict. See, so far, Israel has killed more than 34,000 Palestinians. The world thinks it's genocide, ICJ especially, and the United Nations Security Council has actually asked Israel to stop the killing, but they have not. Israel's intention is to drive the Palestinians to Egypt or towards the border, Rafah border, and they have also mentioned that they want to kill all the Palestinians, wipe them out. The question is, why is there the need to kill Palestinians? What is the motive? Well, there is a profit motive behind it. Way back in 1999, British gas discovered huge reserves of oil and gas in the coast of Gaza Strip. Israel has been blocking the Palestinians from exploiting the oil and gas. And it continues to block the Palestinians to exploit the oil and gas. Now, in recent months, demand for LNG, which is liquid natural gas, has skyrocketed, especially in Europe. Because Europe, Nord Stream the pipeline has been destroyed. And so they now depend on LNG from the US. And prices of LNG has shot up. Israel spotted an opportunity here. because with the LNG gas prices so high, you know, they could be a supplier to Europe. Who are the other countries that could supply LNG to Europe? Well, there's Russia and there's Iran. But these two countries have been sanctioned. So they really cannot sell the gas to Europe. That's where Israel comes in. If they could tap the Palestinian oil and gas and ship it to or pipe it to Europe, they could make lots of money. Who will profit besides Israel? All the major oil companies will profit too. In the past, the Arab nations have been sort of, they mind their own businesses. They don't really care much about each other. For instance, during the Syrian crisis about 12 years ago, no one in the Middle East helped the refugees. I mean, some of the rich countries in the Middle East could have opened their doors and let in the Syrian refugees, but they didn't, because that's their nature. They just want to mind their own businesses. But now, because of the Gaza uprising, the Arab Muslims are united against Israel and USA. Why USA, you might ask? Well, that's because the USA supports Israel tremendously. Besides supplying them with arms, they also support them with military operations. Why didn't OPEC retaliate against the US like they did in 1971? Well, things have changed. Saudi Arabia, the biggest OPEC supplier of oil, is facing budget deficits for the past few years. So they don't really want to cut off supplies because it will affect their own budget. It's the same. Even if you try to cut off oil to the US has, over the past many years, developed their own oil and gas industry through shale oil. So any retaliation by OPEC against the US and Europe will not work well now. But they are responding, and they are attacking all the military bases in the Middle East through their proxies. Probably the biggest player now is the Yemenis, the Houthis. They've been attacking all the ships that are connected to the US NatWest. Can Israel's population of 10 million wage and fight a war against the Middle Eastern Arabs of 450 million? Apparently, depends. If it's a conventional war, Israel will lose out. That's because it's 600,000 soldiers are not really up to it, because half of them are reservists. Reservists means they have normal jobs, and now they've been asked to do the fighting. They are not trained for guerrilla war, and definitely not trained to fight against 450 million Arabs. So Israel has to depend, as always, on the US. And the US has always been a loyal supporter. Just a month ago, Biden said there's no red line on their support for Israel. So the question is, why is the US always supporting Israel? There are two answers. The first answer is that in America, there's a lobby called the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. They are very efficient. They managed over the years to get the Democrats and the Republicans to support anything that is Israel. The other answer is that it's not just that Israel wants America to help them. It's also because America needs Israel. Way back in 1986, Biden said this: they need Israel to help US strategic interests in the Middle East. Let me explain. Since the 1960s, for the US, you must control the Middle East, because at that time, it was the main source of oil for the world. And they had two allies, Saudi Arabia and Iran. With these two as their allies, the US managed to control all oil coming in and out of the Middle East. But something happened in 1979. There was this Iranian revolution, and the Shah was booted out. So Iran was no longer an ally. What the US did was, well, we have to find another ally. So besides Saudi Arabia, it was Israel. Israel became the other ally. Why? Again, because the Middle East is between China's ambition for its Belt and Road Initiative. You need to go through the Middle East to go to Africa. By controlling Middle East, you actually, in a sense, control or block China's BRI. But 2 years ago, China became Saudi Arabia's biggest importer and exporter. And hearing that the West would want to buy less from Saudi Arabia in the years to come because they're turning green, Saudi Arabia realized that their future lies with China. And so they are, in a sense, no longer the ally of the USA. So with Saudi Arabia out, Israel became the only ally of USA, or what they call the unsinkable aircraft carrier for the US. Besides the US, Europe also backs Israel. These are all the major leaders in Europe. Many, of course, see Europeans as US puppets. The question is, why do these Europeans support US? Well, to me, because the Europeans are facing a second end of empire moment. After the war, most of them lost their colonies and they passed the baton to the US. What the US did was to establish another form of colonialism, which is, instead of conquering, they started these international bodies, World Bank, IMF, which a lot of people say actually exploits the developing country. Europe is in this very funny situation. About a year ago, we have Biden telling the world in front of German Chancellor that if Russia invades Ukraine, he's going to shut down the Nord Stream gas pipeline. And Olaf Scholz just listens, smiling away. Can you imagine? Someone is telling you that he's going to destroy your asset, because Nord Stream is part of the German assets as well, and he smiles happily away. I think the reason that Europeans are happy to be left out because they really see the world as a jungle, and they are the civilized garden. So they rather be a lapdog rather than be a jungle dog. Besides the Arabs, who else is backing the Hamas? Well, Russia has shown its hands. When Gaza uprising happened, Russia moved its missiles and important planes closer to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. There's something happened last October which not many people realize. But another thing is that, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Putin has also, in a show of solidarity, invited the Palestinians to tea in February this year. The question is, why is the Russians trying to antagonize the US Air Force? Well, in October last year, Russia revealed something. It came out with some people saying a new air-to-air missile. This missile can travel more than 300 kilometers because in that few days in October, 24 Ukraine jets were shot down. Normally, 3 per week were shot down. So something Russia brought out, and a lot of people think that it's a new long-range missile. What's significant about this? Singapore is only about 50 kilometers wide. Okay, let's compare the range of the US missile and the Russian missile. The US missile, if placed on one end of Singapore, can go about 100 kilometers. Okay, so a US missile can hit someone over in Bintan Island. The Russian missiles can go to 300, some people think 400 kilometers. So it can hit a plane way out in the South China Sea. This is crucial. It is a game changer. See, it means to say, gone are the days of dogfights, because at 400 or 300 kilometers away, you don't need to see your opponent. You can bring down his jet long before he spots you. It's like this scene from the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. Indiana Jones was about to start a fight with a saber-rattling Arab. He took out his gun and shot him. Okay, if this new Russian missile exists, then the US planes will not be able to challenge Russian planes. Even if the US wanted to pick a fight, the US has got no ammunition to spare. This is a picture of a lot of gun shops in the US. They've run out of shells. The US has, over the past year or two, tried to double its production of artillery shells from 15,000 to 30,000 a year. But Ukraine uses 30,000 shells in 5 days. Israel is also using lots of shells. So the US is basically short of ammunition. To me, this is actually good news, because it means that Russia and US are unlikely to fight over the Middle East area. Only Netanyahu wants a wider conflict, but he has got his own agenda. That's why, looking at this, I think the outlook for Middle East is not that dark. Why? Because there's enough good news. Russia has so far been the neutral party, and it could be the mediator. In fact, a lot of the Arab nations have approached China to be the mediator in this Hamas-Israel conflict. So my forecast for this year is that Israel will probably be bogged down in Gaza and in the northern Hezbollah region. US cannot fight Russia if this missile is correct. It's also running out of ammunition. And another oil crisis is slim for us because the OPEC nations are not going to stop selling oil. They need the money. And lastly, if China steps in as a negotiator, then we are closer to a Palestinian state. Just now I mentioned about the Hamas-Israel war. Now, I'm going to tell you a bit about the two warring parties. Who are they? Well, it's US and China. I'm going to leave out EU because they have been battered so badly that they will not play a significant role. Let's start with China. China has actually been on a lucky streak since September 2001. You see, why do I say that? Because of the World Trade Center destruction. The G7 American forces have focused their attention on fighting terrorism in the Middle East. And it was about the same time that China joined WTO. So for 20 years since 2001, Chinese economy could grow without being harassed. So for China, it's like striking the lottery. China was again lucky 2 years ago. That's when the Ukraine-Russia war started. Again, it diverted the resources of G7 NATO nations towards fighting Russia. Again, China was left unmolested, largely. So it's like striking lottery twice. Again, a few months ago, the Hamas-Israel war erupted, and that has delayed the Battle of Taiwan. All in all, it's like China has struck the lottery 3 times. Now let's look at the Chinese economy. It is not as bad as painted by a lot of Western media. Well, the property market is bad, but don't expect much of a recovery because the Chinese government will not bail developers and homeowners out. Why? Because actually it's not fatal for the Chinese economy. Let me show you this. The loan to value ratio of most homeowners is 50%. That means you need the property price to drop about 50% before the homeowners suffer. Banks' non-performing housing loan is as low as less than 1%. This is actually very safe. And banks' exposure to developers is as low as less than 5%. Again, this is the safe level. Let's move on to the US economy. On paper, it looks good. Growth is at 3.2% for the fourth quarter. But if you look carefully, actually it's all an illusion. Because the US economy requires $2.5 to take out a gain of $1 in GDP. This is all through deficit spending. So the picture is actually not that rosy for the US economy. Besides that, there's inflation, which is, I think, higher than what's reported. And secondly, the oil-producing countries are continuing to restrict oil supply. The big problem for the US economy and a lot of the G7 countries is that over the past 10, 15 years, they have printed too much money. This is the chart showing the US printing money since 1960. The first arrow, that's when the Lehman Brothers collapsed. They increased the money supply, but not as much as the next arrow, which was during just before the COVID started. That's when they really ramped up the money supply 5 times to over $20 trillion and one. All this printing money has led to inflation all over the world. And of course, the Fed has no choice but to control this inflation. And so they raised interest rates 2 years ago. They raised from a low of 0.25% here to its existing 5.5%. There are consequences of this. And the consequences are that those who hold bonds lose money. How much have they lost? Well, if interest rates go up or bond yields go up 1%, you will have lost about 9% in your capital value. 2%, it's almost 18%. And with 3%, you have lost about 27%. Interest rates or yields have gone from 0.5% to 5 something. So that is a major loss for a lot of bondholders and investors. That's why when Silicon Valley Bank went into trouble a year ago, the Fed has to come out with this bank term funding program, which is basically saying, give me all your devalued bonds and I'll give you cash at par value. So that's what they did. But this term is 1 year, and it's run out its term. But I think they'll probably renew it for another year. Another indicator which we looked into is the secured overnight financing rate. This is when financial institutions who require dollars will trade in their 5-star rated treasuries to get money. And the rate charging now is 5.3%, which means that it is a lot of people are borrowing money. Because normally it should be very low. Again, this shows that a lot of people are in trouble and they need to exchange their treasuries for cash. What's the outlook for interest rates? Well, it's going to go up further because a lot of foreigners are selling and the US government themselves, they have to sell to raise money for more deficit spending. Look at this bond yield. It went to a peak of 5%, fell, but now it's creeping up again at 4.3%. So this is major damage for bondholders. Besides that, the US economy is also in trouble. There are other crises it faces. Banking, property, commercial property, car loan, student loan, and zombie firms. They have thrived on the low interest rates. Now with interest rates at close to 4 or 5%, they are suffering. Like flood damaged cars, they may not all have reported their troubles, but they are in trouble. And in the months to come, we'll find out more who else is in trouble. Printing the US dollar has always been the solution to such a problem. In fact, the US has been doing that for past since 1970, over 100 years. That's why its debt ceiling is now $34 trillion. Like I said, this solution used to work, but going ahead, no more. Why? Because of de-dollarization. This is a very important point, and I shall elaborate more in the next chapter. Just now I mentioned that one of the ways of solving the US problems is to print more money. But it won't work now because of de-dollarization. In this chapter, I'll tell you about de-dollarization and why it is part of World War III. I mentioned earlier that World War III comes in many forms: economic, trade, technology, military, psychological, and of course the financial, which is the large fund flows. But part of it is also de-dollarization. And so we have entered the second last chapter of the end of the US dollar about 2 years ago. This happened after the Ukraine-Russian war started. What happened was that the West imposed thousands of sanctions on Russia and stopped Russia from using the international money transaction service SWIFT. Now, this, can you imagine if you are a rich Arab or rich Chinese, your country goes into war with the G7 countries, and you are sanctioned, or your money has been frozen. This is definitely something to think about, because you think one way is to avoid this. It means to avoid using the dollar. This is de-dollarization. And it has gone worse. In the past few weeks, we entered the last chapter of the end of the US dollar. Why? Because Russian bank has $300 billion in assets all over the West. Not only have they frozen it, now the G7 countries want to seize it. So definitely, if you are not convinced, you will definitely be convinced that it's no longer viable to use the US dollar. It's like a bank robbing your money. Would you want to use the bank anymore? You wouldn't. So that's what's happening. So the question is, if everybody stops using a US dollar, then the US dollar will fall and plunge in value. But when will this happen? It won't happen unless there's an alternative. And when is this alternative coming up? When BRICS come out with their own currency. Well, they have no news, concrete news. They've been saying it for months. But one possibility is that, or certainty is that, Russia is ready to go to the gold-backed currency. But apparently not the other BRICS countries. Why? Because they all hold a lot of US treasury. Look at China. China has $700 billion in US treasury. If they were to go to a gold-backed currency, BRICS currency, this $700 billion the dollars could be worthless or fall in value tremendously. So of course, China is not ready to lose $700 billion immediately. It's the same. India has 200 billion, Brazil has 200 billion, Saudi Arabia has about 100 billion, and UAE has about 64 billion. The yellow ones are the BRICS currency. Why would they want to lose that kind of money? Well, Russia is the host of BRICS this year, and Putin will again push his de-dollarization agenda. His earliest would be this October, because that's when all the BRICS currency will meet in Russia for their annual meeting. It is possible that at this meeting, Putin might introduce his BRICS currency. He might. If it is based on gold, then of course it's well known because he's been pushing for it. But it could be, the new currency could also be based on blockchain technology. It's possible, but the thing is that if this happens to pass, then there will be an alternative for the US dollar. If the new BRICS currency is gold-backed, then of course a lot of people will want to switch out of the US dollar into this new currency. And foreigners hold more than $32 trillion of US financial assets. I'm not talking about properties, just financial assets. They might want to get out of it. And if just a fraction of $32 trillion of investors' money move out of the US dollar could fall dangerously low. And not only that, they will also dump the G7 currencies. Why? Because these G7 currencies are interlinked to the US dollar, to what we call currency swaps. Now, this is a very interesting arrangement. If let's say the Euro Bank wants to print more euros, if they print more, more euros means that euro exchange rate will weaken. So what they do is the Euro Central Bank will make an arrangement with the US Bank. We do a currency swap. So although I print, let's say, a trillion dollars of euro, I will exchange it for US dollars. So the euro will not appear in the market, but the equivalent of 1,000 euros will appear in the market. So that's what's been happening the past many years. This is the US banks' effort to save the European banks as well, because they are also in trouble. So EU has now a nice deal, or rather they have had a nice deal with the US for a long time. The US supplies the military protection through NATO, and when they are in trouble, the US Fed will do a currency swap with the European banks. And with the savings, because if you don't need to spend money on the military, you can use your money saved to build, well, what many regard the best standard of living in the world, the European system, whereby the governments will support welfare programs, fund the arts, and give nice pensions to Europeans. Years of this printing of money, years of giving welfare programs to Europeans have now ballooned the debt of all the G7 countries. But they have not broken down, primarily because the US is the reserve currency and basically the only currency used in the world. When the BRICS currency appears, or an alternative appears, then everybody will start dumping the dollar. And with the dollar down, the US empire will collapse too. When the US dollar goes down, the European way of life will collapse too. Because like I said, the euro and the US dollar are interlinked. It will all collapse like this Baltimore's Key Bridge a few weeks ago. That's why you must understand the EU leaders are always supporting the USA. Because if de-dollarization happens, it will destroy Europe as well. So, what's the expected pathway in the weeks and months ahead? The current low interest rates will lead to inflation. And with inflation will lead to higher US interest rates. Powell has got no choice. And high interest rates is bad for the markets and the US empire. But if the BRICS currency appears before that, then it will be bad for the US dollar and the US empire. Is there a way out for the US, G7, NATO countries? There is, and I shall elaborate in the next chapter. I just mentioned that de-dollarization will happen either through BRICS created currency or through natural de-dollarization. In this next chapter, I'm going to tell you what the G7 NATOs can do to stop de-dollarization. Well, because first of all, the question they must ask is, who is the champion of de-dollarization? And of course, there's no other than Putin. That's why they want to remove him from power and break up the Russian Federation. But as I mentioned before, it has not been successful. It's been done before. In 2006, Saddam Hussein wanted to sell oil in euros. He was removed, killed. In 2011, Colonel Gaddafi wanted to come out with a gold-backed currency for the Middle Eastern country. He was killed. Getting rid of Putin now is impossible. Why? Because he just won his election with 87% majority. Who else besides Putin can do de-dollarization? The answer is China. China can de-dollarize to what I call natural de-dollarization. You see, look at this picture here. Chinese economy has been growing in PPP terms since 2005, and it is today actually bigger than the American economy. When an economy is large and dominant, most people will want to use their currency. In the same way, why do we learn the English language? Because the language of the dominant culture is English. So likewise, natural de-dollarization can happen without China doing anything, just by growing. What's the relevance to the Middle Eastern conflict? Remember, I told you, with the US in control of the Middle East, they can block China's Belt Road Initiative. When you block China's Belt Road Initiative, you slow down China's growth. You slow down natural de-dollarization. Attempts have been made over the years to stop China from growing too fast. Tariffs, arresting the Huawei CFO, chip wars, labeling the virus a Chinese virus, instigating troubles in the South China Sea, and of course the latest is try to remove TikTok. When all this failed, and it looks like they have failed, the only solution is to have a battle against China through Taiwan. The neocons really believe that they can beat China like they did 120 years ago in the Boxer Rebellion. But if the war were to come, it won't be this year. There are 4 reasons why I believe the Battle of Taiwan will not happen this year. Number 1, the US military is bogged down and short of ammunition. Number 2, Biden is eyeing the November elections. He won't want to have a war on his hands in the middle of his election. Number three, China still, or rather the US needs China to continue to buy its treasuries. Janet Yellen was in China in early April to secretly get them to buy treasury. The fourth reason, which is quite also very important, but it's not widely reported, but this happened in December last year. There was a Chinese battle group moving from north to south. The US wanted to interfere with the passage. They brought the Nimitz battle group moving from east to west to try to disturb the Chinese battle group. What the Chinese did was to send their cruisers, one of the cruisers, towards the American battle group. Now, this cruiser is the latest. It has got 48 hypersonic missiles, and each battle group has about 35 to 40 ships. When the Chinese cruiser approached the US battle group, it turned on its radar and its targeting system. So all its 48 missiles were aimed at the US carrier group. The US carrier group for 20 days tried to avoid this lock-on their ship, but they couldn't. After 20 days of trying, they gave up and made a U-turn. The Chinese captain apparently was given a medal for his work. Now, if this news of this Chinese missiles and Chinese radar is true, it's a game changer. It's like, again, seeing from Raiders of Lost Ark. Harrison Ford against the saber-rattling Arab. Because if the Chinese cruiser is capable of hitting with a hypersonic missile, it will be way before the US carrier missiles or the US planes can hit the Chinese cruiser. It means if any war, conventional war, the US ships will be hit first before the Chinese ships can be hit. This is a game changer. So, if you can't beat China in a conventional war, the alternative is to beat China in a nuclear. And this is possible. You look at the chart on the left, Russia has about 5,000 nukes. US has also 5,000. So that's why the Russians and the US are don't want to have a nuclear war between themselves. But between the US and China, China has only about 400 or 500 nukes. If there's a war, a nuclear war, US can take out 5,000 cities and China can take out 400 cities. This threat alone might deter China from waging a war or surrendering. But will China actually surrender again? This is debatable. Now the question is, why would you want to start a war with China? What would a war achieve to save the dying dollar? Well, if you look at history, there are incidents that happened before. During the Second World War, a lot of Southeast Asian countries were using Japanese currency. When the Japanese lost and left, all their currencies became worthless. Now, if this were to happen between a nuclear war between US and China loses, the US would say, all right, now that you've lost the war, the renminbi is no longer legal tender, which means you cannot use it to trade outside China. Maybe within China, among Chinese, they'll trade using renminbi. But if you want stuff from overseas, you have to use hard cash. So at a stroke, all the Chinese workers will have to work very hard to produce things so that they can sell abroad and get the US dollar. So a nuclear war and a victory of the nuclear war over China can save the dying dollar. And not only that, it can also save the other G7 currencies, which are equally abundant. That's why when they talk of fighting for Ukraine, Taiwan, they talk about democracy and human rights. That is not the truth. What they are really fighting is they are fighting de-dollarization so that they can maintain their imperialistic position. In conclusion, and this is my last slide, World War III started in 2018 and is now in its last chapter. G7 NATO won't dare to fight Russia because Russia is military appears to be so much stronger than the G7 NATO. Between the G7 NATO and China, it looks like in a conventional war, China will win. But in a nuclear war, China could lose or surrender. If there's no war, then de-dollarization will proceed, either through BRICS or through natural de-dollarization. That is, when China grows bigger and its economy grows bigger, everyone will want to use the renminbi rather than the US dollar. So ultimately, it looks like both ways, unless a nuclear war is started, it will be a disaster for G7 NATO countries beyond this year, after the November election, or after the BRICS currency is introduced from October this year.